Hi, Ken. Welcome to the show.
Hello.
Hi, great to have you here.
Thank you.
So, it's really exciting to have you here. I went to Naropa 20 some odd years ago when I really got introduced to your work in the transpersonal program over there. And, when I got one of your books in my hands, it definitely changed me of like, right, let's think about philosophy and healing in a synthesized way, rather than kind of a granular, islandy, broken apart system of thought. And so you really helped reorient me. I thought we would start off with a kind of grand question that, getting your take on here, which is really about like, where are we at in the human journey right now in terms of consciousness, the evolution of humanity, the evolution of human consciousness and the way we think about things, and the way we perceive the world as more of a collective of humanity, and where are we at in that journey? Where have we come from? Where are we at?
I think one of the best ways to understand how culture moves is through developmental approaches. They're not everything, but they tell us an enormous, quite a bit about where we are, where we're going, what we can expect, and so on. And as an example, if you look at developmental research today, and there are an enormous number of models of different developmental features. In the book Integral Psychology, I actually included over 100 developmental models. And in the back, I have a chart of all of them and the levels of development they've given and so on. But what's I find interesting about it is, let's say that the average American is at what I would call an orange or a rational or an achievement stage of development. And then the next stage, of course, is postmodern, green, multicultural, metasystemic, equity, diversity, and so on. And let's say that even though only about 20% of the population is at those postmodern stages, let's say we wanted to know what tomorrow is going to bring us in terms of that kind of awareness. Well, what we have are studies that show another 2 or 3, in some cases 4, stages of development beyond the postmodern. And so those are based on empirical research, and they actually look at how individuals develop beyond green. And when they do so, as in all developmental studies, in a series of discrete stages, and they unfold in a particular order. So what we can assume, since developmental stages, as long as we've been testing them, do that, they go through a series of discrete stages that move towards higher, more complex, more unified, more conscious stages of development. So if we can just expect those stages to continue, then we'll know what tomorrow is going to look like. So beyond green, there are teal stages, turquoise stages. These 2 stages are generally referred to, as you know, as second-tier stages, because they bring a particular type of wholeness or holism that is lacking in all of the previous so-called first-tier stages. And a first tier stage is defined as a stage that believes that its truth and values are the only real truth and values in existence. And everybody else is confused or goofy or childish or just plain wrong in their views. And then when we get the move from first tier to second tier, Claire Graves called it a monumental shift and a cataclysmic shift in meaning. Because what happens when you get to second tier, teal or turquoise, we also call teal holistic and turquoise integral. It doesn't matter what names we choose for them. But those stages are the first stages that think that as they look at all of the growth stages that humans have gone through, they're the first stages that intuit that all of the previous stages are actually important and they need to be included. So that makes them different from all the previous stages that think they're the only important stages in existence. Second tier stages think all of the previous stages are important. If for no other reason, then they're all a part of our a total human growth. And so none of those can be deleted or skipped or downplayed, just like if you're going from atoms to molecules to cells to organisms. You can't go from atoms to organisms and skip molecules and cells. It just,
Right.
it doesn't work.
And
So-
globally, Ken, let me just ask a clarification here. So when we think about this from, as we talk about this as a developmental stage model, in terms of the human psychology, is it that there's an evolution over time on Earth where over time global humanity is moving up in stages, or is there just so much diversity on this planet that we're just anywhere on the given planet, there's always a stage present and it just will always be that way?
What evolutionary stages tend to give us is, and frankly, right now, there is an enormous amount of theoretical discussion and disagreement among orthodox biological evolutionists about what evolution consists of. And there's sort of two components to that. One is the what of evolution, and one is the why of evolution. The what of evolution is still accepted by almost everybody. It's simply a list of the time periods when various different holons came into existence. So they will agree that just on Earth, for example, there were just one cellular organisms, and then those expanded into multicellular organisms. And then those expanded through a tree of life of, first there were fish, and then amphibians, and then reptiles, and then mammals, and then humans. And nobody disagrees with that particular order that those things came into existence. And so when most biologists say biology makes no sense without evolution, what they're at least referring to is the order of emergence of the different stages of evolution. And that goes all the way back to the Big Bang, when we can track the emergence of subatomic particles to molecules, to cells, and so on. So that's a bit of how, but when it comes to the why of evolution, that's where there's a lot of disagreement, even among orthodox scientists. So somebody like Stuart Kaufman from the Santa Fe Institute will say, no, natural evolution, natural selection is not enough to drive all of the changes and the diversity we see in evolution. There has to be something like, well, Ilya Prigogine, for example, I think in 1976 got the Nobel Prize for demonstrating that even insentient matter has in it a drive that he called order out of chaos. So there's an inherent drive, according to this school of evolution, there's an inherent drive towards greater complexity, greater wholeness, greater integration, and some would even add greater consciousness. And that's built in to the universe. That order out of chaos drive starts with the Big Bang. And so that's where you get sort of two that's where a lot of the disagreement in modern evolutionary biology, that's what they're arguing about is, okay, what's the nature of, is there a force in the universe that drives towards greater and greater unity and greater complexity? In other words, is there a drive that counteracts the second law of thermodynamics? And if you look at least in the path it's led up to the Earth, of course there is, because the universe isn't winding down, the universe is winding up. I mean, it just gets more and more complex. So if you take a theorist like Alfred North Whitehead, and he gives what he calls his three ultimate. And these are the three principles that you need in order to get any universe up and running in the first place. The first principle is the one, the second principle is the many, and the third principle is the interesting one. He called it the creative advance into novelty. So that again is what Stuart Kaufman would call a self-organization principle. Eric Jantz called it self-organization through self-transcendence. But that all of that's looking at a side of evolution that is causing more complexity and more diversity and more integration. And so that's gives us a distinctly different type of framework if we want to think about evolution. And that's certainly the case if we want to think about the evolution of higher states of consciousness or so on. And so going back then to developmental studies, what they tend to show is, and of course they stretch these studies out over the whole animal kingdom, but they particularly focus on humans. And what you find with human beings is that from conception, they're driven by this self-organization principle, or self-organization through self-transcendence, or order out of chaos. They just get more and more complex, and clever developmental psychologists have actually studied the stages that this complexity grows in. And that's what makes developmental studies an incredibly important study for human beings. Because as I was saying, if you want to know what the future is going to look like, one of the areas, of course, we can study a lot of areas. We can study the growth of technology, financial systems, you name it. But one of the ones we tend to overlook is the developmental approaches, and particularly the levels that have been demonstrated. When I say demonstrated, they're looking at higher levels, but they find people who are actually at these higher levels and they study them. So again, if you take something like cognitive development and you have Piaget going from pre-operational to concrete operational to formal operational, in Piaget's notebooks, he started talking about a systemic stage that was beyond formal operational. And that's where most of the recent research in developmental psychology has occurred. And so they actually find examples of people at these 3 or 4 higher stages beyond formal operational. They include metasystemic. Commons and Richards referred to them as metasystemic, systemic, then metasystemic, then paradigmatic, and then cross-paradigmatic. And the paradigmatic stages were all in second tier because they all work to realize the wholeness of all the previous stages of development. And that, if that's the case, then it means as human beings, as we continue to evolve on this earth, we're going to continue to go into those higher stages ourselves. There's going to be more people that move into those higher stages. If every single previous stage of development has proved correct, and so far there's nothing to indicate that developmental psychology is wrong, so we assume that it just continues pointing in the direction we're going. And so right now, you can say the Middle Ages were marked by a mythic stage of development. It's also called ethnocentric because it gave privileges to just special groups. Like if you're a Christian and a devout Christian and you die, then you get to go to heaven and live with Jesus Christ on the right-hand side of God Almighty forever. But if you're a Hindu, you don't get to do that. You're going to fry in hell. And same if you're a Jew or so on. So it went from ethnocentric to, during the Enlightenment, it moved from mythic stages of understanding into rational stages of understanding. And then into, starting the 1960s, a stage that is generally referred to as the postmodern stage emerged. And that supplanted the stage of modernity, which was ruled by reason. It's called the Age of Reason. And then postmodernity started tearing down all of that. So rationality is to be distrusted. There's no objective truth, and so on. So that's where we are right now. And that looks fairly problematic in terms of what it's producing for our society. And everybody's noticed this. We call it, there's a certain wokeism of people that sort of buy into this new post-objective, post-truth, multicultural diversity stage of development. And that just seems to be an increasing polarization and retribalization that's occurring. But if we continue growing, and there is, again, about 20% of the population at the postmodern stage. At the previous modern stage, there's about 30%. At the previous mythic stage, it's starting to die down. So there's maybe 25 to 30% of the population that's there. And as for second tier integral, there's only about 5 to 7% of the population that are at those stages. What we find is that when any leading edge stage becomes about 10% of the population, then there tends to be a tipping point. And what that means is that the values of that higher stage tend to kind of seep down into the culture, and the culture becomes more open to the values of these higher stages. Now, so that means modernity and post-modernity would start to accept the values of an integral age when we continue to develop through the stages that we already know are there. And that's
Does there
rather
tend to be,
point out.
Ken, does there tend to be a kind of increased time period of chaos while that transition happens? Like, or is it just a smooth transition when that flip starts happening where more of the the culture starts moving into the next stage? I mean, I guess also a question in that is, where are we at right now, where with this sort of seems to be a heightened, at least in, we could say in America, but elsewhere, there's a heightened chaos right now, a lot going on. And is that representative of these developmental stages in some way and something that's happening?
Yeah, particularly in first tier, because they are ones that are fighting for their own territory, unlike second tier, which tends to embrace all of them as having some importance. But in first tier, when you move from one tier to the next tier, the tiers tend to be contradictory. So in the mythic stage, you had an emphasis on community, and you had to all be in conformity with the way that culture thought, which meant you had to be in conformity with the Catholic mode of thinking. And the churchmen didn't have to look through Galileo's telescope because the Bible told them exactly what they'd see and stuff like that. But then when we moved from mythic Middle Ages to rational Enlightenment, those didn't get along very well. And so there tended to be some conflict between them. Particularly, we started the battle between science and religion at that point. But then when modernity, science, enlightenment went forward about 200 years, it ran into the first emergence of another major structure, which we've been calling the postmodern structure. It's also referred to as meta-systemic, because it can reflect on the systemic frameworks that rationality created. And that's why the postmodernists spend all of their time attacking the universal systems that modernity set up. Mm-hmm. So we tend to see, because each first tier structure contradicts its previous structure, moving from one to the other is always a little bit fraught with difficulties and some turmoil, some better, some worse, but we seem historically to find that happening all the time. What we don't know is what will happen when we move from first tier, where everybody's at each other's throats, to second tier, which doesn't have those assumptions at all. It's structures that embrace and enfold and integrate previous structures. So
how Ken, I'm curious of, I think one of the burning questions is, if we're only at 7 or 8% at tier 2,
right,
are we going to make it to 10% before it's too late for the impact and that kind of watershed moment to happen?
Well, that's what we're watching to try to figure out. So there is some good news in terms of how fast development occurs. When I started studying this, the percentage of the population at second tier, and remember, each model, because it's working usually on a different multiple intelligence, will tend to develop a metric that tells where people are in terms of their own model, the stage of their own model that the person's at. And those can vary a relative amount. They all still have essentially similar stages, but these stages can grow in uneven ways. So if you measure cognitive development in one population, you might get 50 or 60% are reaching world-centric or rational levels, you might find moral development is at only about 40%, and emotional development, emotional intelligence might be even less, at 30%. So you have to kind of keep that in mind. So when I say 5 to 7 or 8%, that's an average of all of the models and all of the empirical results they get. But when I first started studying it, the overall percentage of second tier was only about 3%. And if you look at teal and turquoise, which are so far the two most often identified stages of second tier, the highest, called turquoise, there was only 0.5% of the people at turquoise. And I used to, when people would come around and talk to me, and I'd want to say, we're facing a new paradigm. There's a worldwide transformation occurring. We're all moving into this great oneness. And I just get out this hat and put it on, and it had written 0.5%.
Nice.
Yeah, it was just sort of my reminder. But now that it's to 5 to 7%, that's a fair amount of growth. And some positive estimates put it that will hit 10% in, it could be 10 years. But I mean, we're all guessing when we say
Yeah.
these things.
It's
But
interesting. The 10% watershed moment's interesting because as Keith and I have worked to develop an integrated model for our practitioners who come and learn in the Institute, the conversation has been, if we could educate 10% of the psychiatrists in this country with a more expanded perspective about root causes and actually addressing what's going on, rather than, and from a transcend and include perspective that, we owe, in large part to your work, is that, it's not about throwing out the old model. It's about bringing forward a fuller sense of what can happen. It's just interesting that number has been the same one that Keith and I have been working on over here.
Well, and I've also seen at least a couple studies, I think one out of Stanford, showing that if you have a group of people and there are sort of some difficult questions that they're trying to decide on, when 10% of the population fully adopts one of the solutions, that's often enough to tip the rest of them to come across. So apparently it's not just a made up number. So we're looking for 10% at second tier. And that would be by literally every developmental model in existence has these major stages, going from mythic sort of Middle Ages to rational Enlightenment stages to postmodern pluralistic relativistic stages to at least 2 integrated or integral stages. And so at least being able to point to some higher stages, which we have extremely abundant information that they exist. And that's the point I'm trying. They exist as much as the previous stages do. So the point is, okay, if you have a stage model that has, let's say, 6 stages of major development, and it's all been checked out and certified, and we're all ready to go, aren't there higher stages?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
well, it seems like to me that was one of the things that Carl Jung was saying to Freud, is there are additional stages here, buddy. It's not just about the ego.
Right.
And having a healthy ego is the beginning of the journey, not the end of the journey.
Right.
Which reminds me, I'm wondering how how do you feel? I mean, when we talk about getting from, 5 to 7% to 10%,
Yeah.
are there accelerants that you feel are worth, like when Keith and I were, one of the things we do is we have, we have a psychedelic therapy training to get in, to try to get people ready for the possibility that there may be psychedelic therapy widely available in the next few years, to help people get from a tier 1
Yeah.
situation to tier 2.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about the use of psychedelics to help evolve consciousness?
Right, which is a good subsequent question that you had, which I'll be glad to address it now. When the psychedelics hit in the 60s, I was a classic boomer, and with one exception, as I really never got into the drug culture. So I never really did LSD or psilocybin or mescaline or any of those. But when the government chose to make all of those drugs illegal in a class with heroin, I was infuriated. And I was infuriated because I at least had read all the literature on psychedelics, and including individual people writing about their accounts like Aldous Huxley and Alan Watts and all of that. And it was clear to me that these were opening up some very, very profound and I think natural states of consciousness. So I was delighted when recently psilocybin research was picked up in, what was it, Princeton or someplace like that?
Johns Hopkins.
Johns Hopkins,
Yeah.
right. And the results that they were getting was just stunning. And I mean, not just in things like, Jordan Peterson always reports this, things like stopping cigarette smoking. One dose with mystical experience, psilocybin, stops cigarette smoking 85% of the time. And the best they've got of any other kind of drug is like 20%. I mean, so Peterson just really blabbers on that this is some amazing kind of thing. But
Ken, in your perspective, is that a shift in these tiers that's happening?
I think it's probably connected. And one of the things that we don't know, and that we do need a lot of research on, is the relation of these structures of consciousness versus states of consciousness. Because there are some similarities, but there are also some important differences. States, for example, you can tend to have peak experiences of a state of consciousness. And the traditions divide states into like gross, subtle, causal, turiya, turiyatita. And these are all states, but you can have a higher state experience of any one of those. So even the highest state, which is generally taken to be some sort of unitive consciousness or cosmic consciousness or something like that, if you had to go through these states one at a time, the number of people that would have cosmic conscious experiences would be very small. But polls consistently show that the last one I saw was 60% of Americans said they had had a full-fledged unity consciousness experience. So you can peak experiences. You cannot peak experience structures. That doesn't work at all. So if you're at moral stage 1, you cannot peak experience moral stage 6. You need to have a moral stage 2, on top of it to be able for it to get up a little higher, and then a moral stage 3, and then it can get up a little higher than a moral stage 4. It can get a little higher than the moral stage 5. And at a moral stage 5, because stage 6, the highest, is the next stage up, you can start to have little peak experiences of that. That's actually how you'll end up developing into it. But you can't peak experience.
Can you spontaneously, let's say on a psychedelic, go from a stage 2 to a 6 as a structure? Can you structurally move that quickly in a moment, or you're saying that it just takes time no matter what?
It takes time.
Okay.
It takes time. And that's one of the reasons that you also, there's structures seem to be more like rules of grammar, which are sort of third person rules that we all follow when we learn a language. But we can't look within and see those rules of grammar, even though you and I are both following a whole set of rules of grammar right now. We can't introspect and see them. The same is true of structures of, well, structures. You can't introspect them. You can't look within and see them. But states of consciousness, if you're meditating and you have a state of consciousness where you become one with the universe in bliss and love, you know it. It's completely, fully conscious when you have a state. But when you have a structure and you're operating from it, you have no idea you're operating from that structure. And that's why structures weren't discovered until about 100 years ago with James Mark Baldwin. But states like shamanic states or even Zen, Satori states, they go back thousands of years. Because when you have one of those experiences, it's a first person, direct, immediate experience, and you know it.
Can states, so if we go back to psychedelics for a moment, just so we're on that, it sounds like from what I'm understanding here is that psychedelics may, of course, initiate a state.
Right.
But they will not initiate in just one session a movement from one structure to a next. But is it that those states can actually speed up the transition? You know, like let's say, you know, normally it would have taken you 5 years to make that transition in structure.
Right.
Can that peak experience speed up the process into moving into a new worldview structure it comes quicker because of psychedelic use?
Yes. See, and that's why I say we don't understand the relation between structures and states, but we can start hypothesizing about what some of them are. And it does look to me like certain higher states can exert an influence on structures that helps them move up a little more quickly. And so even in meditation, studies of meditation practitioners, if you take, for example, the percentage of people at second tier, at best, like if you get a group of smart students or something, it can be 20%. But if you take college students and each year, or once a day, each year, they practice meditation for at least 20 to 40 minutes a day, then the percentage of those people that reach second tier is 72%. So it's clearly over a long time, it's having an exertion on structures so that they do grow more quickly. And meditation is one of the things that can demonstrate that kind of growth of structures. And it's one of the few things that does, by the way. So that's an important point. And how I think that happens is when you're meditating and you're practicing mindfulness and a subject that you're identified with comes up and you make it an object, then you're objectifying it, you're freeing it, you're getting it out of your identification with it. I see it as an object, it's no longer a part of my subject. And as you continue to do that, that's what happens in meditation is subjects are seen to become objects. Subjects are seen until they become objects. And then when you've basically seen all of the subjects of your mind, including your ego, and so when all of those have become object, then there's just pure emptiness left.
Mhm.
And that's called satori.
Right.
So I think that's how this tend to work. And I think that capacity to make subject object is what helps structures move more
Mhm.
quickly.
So on the internal inner inner experience side, the conversion or the shift from perceiving subject to perceiving object is happening. That's supporting this shift in more of a trait or a shift in consciousness.
Yeah.
And I'm also wondering, shifting gears a little bit to more of the interpersonal. What is your current perspective about partnership and relationships and the role or the pros and cons of a long conversation between two people in
Right.
partnership?
Let me see what I have on my notes that I wanted to do that for. Healthy relationships involve in partners who they have engaged in growing up and cleaning up, and then have honesty, trust, love, respect, and open communication, and taken effort to compromise. So adding growing up and cleaning up were just ways of talking about, in a sense, orthodox practices of growing up. Just means to be aware that you're going through stages of development. Just be aware of that. Studies have shown that people that even learn the stages of a growing up model will tend to move through those stages more quickly, because their brain just knows, wait a minute, however I'm seeing this, I think I'm seeing it right, but I could have even a higher view of this. And just knowing that sort of helps open that view. It still takes a while to fill out a structure and be able to see it. So we're limited in the amount of quickness that we can make that subject into an object, but anything quicker can help. And it particularly helps by the amount it will help move us into those higher structures, like second tier from 20% to 72%. I absolutely fell off my chair when I first read that, when I first saw that study. But the thing that is important for me about partnerships and long-lasting partnerships is, in addition to simply how they can interact with each other, and if you are taking up something like cleaning up, then being able to go through that with your partner can make an enormous amount of difference. Because one of the main things with cleaning up, as you know, is you can repress or disown aspects of yourself, and then you'll often project those aspects onto another. And so if I have a bit of adulterous impulses in me and I don't like them, so I shut them out and disown them, and I project them onto my partner, then all of a sudden I think my partner is fooling around on me, and I might even accuse them of it. And of course, if they're not, which they probably aren't at all, they'll be shocked and upset. And most fights get into those kinds of things from projecting shadow elements onto another and then seeing them as possessing them.
One way, Ken, to maybe really a good way to maybe split this out for the listener, maybe just describe a little bit the path of what the benefits are of the path of the householder who's relating to a partner every day in terms of moving structures and stages versus, let's say, the path of the meditator who's not in partnership and working with themselves, and the benefits of both and what are the drawbacks of both. Like maybe just contrast those two paths a little bit in terms of how to be moving between structures and what each yields there.
The two things you want me to contrast are when you say,
let's say the
household,
path of the meditator,
right,
who's really focused on that. They're not in partnership. They're focused on individual self-reflection.
What I call the waking up process.
Waking up
Yeah.
with self.
Yes.
Versus someone's on the path of waking up maybe in relationship to a person. They're not a big meditator. That's not their thing. And just those two paths.
Well, they are two relatively different paths, and they it's hard to even say whether it's better to have at least one person on the path and the other is just going about sort of normal life, whether that works out better or whether it's just a wash and they just ought to go their separate ways. I tend to think that any of the aspects of a full wholeness, and that includes showing up, growing up, waking up, opening up, cleaning up, that the more a person is involved in any one of those integral aspects of working on themselves, then the better things get in general. And that generally includes the better they get along with their colleagues, with their friends, and with their partners. So even if your partner is not engaged in one of those holistic practices, waking up in meditation, growing up, working on their growth scale, opening up to the many multiple intelligences that people have, showing up to all the major dimensions and perspectives that a person has. But the more any of those areas of wholeness are engaged in, my experience is the generally better the person does with most of their other relationships. And it can be tricky because some of these, like a cleaning up process or even a waking up process, none of these are a day at the beach. None of these are easy walks that you can just snap your finger and there I'm now awake, or just a quick look at shadow material and now I've cleaned up all my mess. They can be tough. And so even if in a relationship, one person is focusing on one aspect of increasing their wholeness, that can bring up great difficulties in itself. And it's better under those circumstances to be with somebody who's going through the similar process. So you can share the difficulties that you have, you can exchange them with each other, you can explain what's happening, you can ask for help for the difficulty you're having in it. And if you are with a partner you're trying to wake up and they're also undergoing waking up, then that's going to be much better that both of you are doing that. In growing up, the same thing. It's really good to know where you are in growing up, because if you look at the type of arguments and disagreements that stem from each stage of growing up, you can start to see just how important those are. For instance, I was saying we could give many different names to the stages of growing up. But if we take Gene Gebser's, who's generally acknowledged to be a genius in the developmental area, and his stages are archaic to magic, to mythic, to rational, to pluralistic, to integral. Now, you can just see, and each one of those first tier terms, archaic, magic, mythic, rational, and pluralistic, none of them get along with each other. And so if your partner is at a distinctly, strongly different stage of development than you are, there's going to be some real problems. And you're going to have to figure out some way to work them out. There's a guy named Eric something or other, who's written some beautiful books on integral relationships. And he's worked with thousands of people now. First, he does a psychograph to sort of get a sense of where are they on waking up, growing up, cleaning up, showing up, and so on. Martin Uchek. He says that basically, if you're in a different position in any of these different areas, growing up, showing up, opening up, cleaning up, it can work out. He says, I've found ways that partners can work this out. And you just have to talk about it. You have to know a little bit about it. You have to study it just a little bit, but you can work it out fairly easily. He says, for people that are different stages of growing up, he just has one response to that. He says, good luck. In other words,
it makes sense to me that, kind of going back to what you were saying before about individuals, and honestly, this is one of my favorite parts of your work, is the acknowledgement that a person can be at very different developmental stages in different areas of their life. That if you and your partner are at different developmental stages in these different areas, that if you have the right view, those differences can actually be places where you can support and pull each other up, like two rock climbers who are on belay with each other going up the mountain, in different areas. That makes sense.
Yeah. So I'm not sure exactly where we are in terms of, did we finish the topic that was brought up?
I think so. I think we'll take another 5 or so minutes to wrap up here. And I want to kind of pivot us to something that's now been mentioned many times when we're talking about the term waking up. There's a question we had asked you before we did this interview about non-dual awareness and, the concept of enlightenment. And when we talk about like more in the yogic traditions, and we're talking about the highest levels of samadhi, that, so the question has multiple parts. One, is there a final stage of waking up as it's described in sort of the final stage of samadhi, where you're in, non-dual awareness, you're there, you don't leave it, and you're there. That's it. You attained it, you stay, there's no fluctuation. And I'm curious about your thoughts on this in terms of, does that description of enlightenment hold up to you? That you can actually abide in a non-dual awareness, get there and stay there with no fluctuation?
Right. Well, to just give a short answer to that, yes, I believe that is possible. But to give a more extended, sort of more accurate answer, it really is a spectrum. And one of the main problems is that as you start along this spectrum, and by the way, the spectrum tends to run from what both Vedanta and Vajrayana refer to as gross to subtle to causal to Turiya-tita. And gross is just your typical ordinary thinking. It's chaotic. It's sometimes called the monkey mind. It's the source of human suffering and all of that. And then the subtle is a form of awareness that cuts between thoughts. So thoughts stop start to stop and drop out. And subtle is a site of illumination, and tends to have is the seat of what we call soul, whereas the waking or gross or ego state tends to be the home of the ego. So as you're moving along these stages, you're moving from ego to soul to self, capital S, to spirit. And what tends to happen is that as you move along that, maybe 10 or 15 years from now, you'll be much more at the end of soul and spirit, and that's where you'll tend to reside. But what happens at the beginning, like when you get your first Satori in your waking state, you feel, wow, I made it. I am one with everything. Nothing could ever get better. And that tends to be a problem, because that's exactly what you fall back from. And so the people that talk about, oh, I'm enlightened, and then you watch them and they're functional messes, you start to think, okay, I don't think enlightenment's doing what they think it's doing. But as you continue to go and generally shift, and again, this is making subject into object. When you're identified with ego, that's your subject. You think that's you. But when you start to bring in a witnessing, soul or Turiya awareness, and you witness your mind and you practice mindfulness on it, then you start to see that subject. And as you see that subject, it becomes object. And now you're seeing it from a higher stage of the spectrum of consciousness. And so you're, in each of these cases, you're making subject object until all of the independent selves, whether that's soul or capital L self, when those are all seen as objects, then you stopped identifying with them. By definition, they're no longer your subject. They're no longer yourself. And so that's why Zen Master Shibayama calls Zen realization absolute subjectivity. And it doesn't mean the subject is sort of abject versus object. It means there's a subjective realm in you that's made all small subjects and all small objects, they're being seen by a subjectivity that is absolute. And so at that point, you drop all identity with these small subject and object selves that you've identified with. And then when you move from absolute subjectivity, which is Turiya, and Turiya just means the fourth state. It's named the fourth after the first three of gross, subtle, causal. Those are the first, second, and third. And so Turiya is just in Sanskrit, all Turiya it means literally is the fourth. It's not exactly an imaginative term for this state. Well, it's just the fourth after those three that you've gotten rid of. So the fourth is just pure consciousness without an object at all. And when the more you tend to get into these, the more you'll tend to stay in them. And when you're in that state of pure consciousness without an object, then just as you could, when you were dreaming, get into a state, bring consciousness into dreams so that you would lucid dream. Well, when you reach a state of consciousness, then the traditions maintain that this is the state you're in when you're in deep dreamless sleep, and which is just absolutely no objects arising at all, nothing you can see, but there is just a sense of I amness or pure subjectivity or pure absolute subjectivity. And so the fifth state, Turyatita, is when even the witness or absolute subjectivity or consciousness breaks down as having any remnant of subjectivity at all. And so it collapses. The subject becomes one with absolutely everything it's aware of. And this is called non-dual. Tibetans call it one taste. And it's just the suchness or thusness of each moment. It's not you standing back as a witness and watching this. And so as this one taste starts to permeate your being, then you really aren't, as long as the one taste consciousness is in present, you really aren't any of those small selves. And so it just depends on your whole progress through this whole spectrum of waking up. And the more you get to one end of it, the more you appear to be enlightened, and you don't fall back into egoic nonsense as much, and so on. But that's a serious trip. It takes a fairly long time. And one of the reasons I'm interested in like psilocybin is that seems to give, again, we were talking about how they can affect states and structures, but it seems to give some brief introduction to those higher ultimate states, either the fourth or the fifth state. And people describe it as profoundly mystical experience, as it being oneness with everything, as finding a deep compassion in their heart for other individuals that they realize are living at this end of the spectrum, which is marked by suffering and pain and anguish and torment. And so that to me is a very interesting part of the psychedelic research, is what can it do to help people get more towards this end more quickly. And again, states, remember, you can bounce around in states. And so I think that psilocybin might be a fairly heavy bouncer towards these states. And then I think that's quite good, actually.
Well, I think it's probably time we should wrap up, right, Will?
Yeah, I think it's a good time. And
we have one more question, which is more about a message that you would want to say to people. So we ask every guest this question, which is, if there was a billboard out there that you had, every human sees it once in their life, there's sort of a paragraph on it that they read, what message would you tell them?
Yeah. Dig into your own deepest potentials. This involves showing up, waking up, growing up, cleaning up, and opening up. This is a fairly complex way to say that you have much more potential that you can explore in yourself. And I'll end with a statement from Abe Maslow, which is, I promise you, if you deliberately set out to be less than you can be, you will be deeply unhappy for the rest of your life.
That's beautiful.
I love it.
Love it.
Maslow. I like pulling in Maslow at the end.
Human potential.
Well,
Yeah.
that was wonderful, Ken. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Of course.
Yeah, that was great.
It's been
So
a
we'll
real
end there.
pleasure. Thank you.